Oftentimes, gallery internships or curatorial assistant roles or museum fellowships, they're really low paid or in some cases not paid. And I think there's been a lot of noise around that over the last few years.
I'm Naomi Ray, and this is The Art Angle, a podcast by Artnet News. This week, we're taking on a subject that affects the majority of the arts workforce: gender inequity in the industry. Women make up the backbone of the art world, but they continue to face barriers when it comes to work-life balance, pay, and career progression. So what does the data actually tell us about the state of the industry? And more importantly, what can be done to change things for the better? To answer those questions, we're unpacking key findings from a major survey conducted by Artnet News in collaboration with the Association of Women in the Arts. More than 2,000 people responded to the call, with an additional 140 participating in a follow-up survey, ultimately providing us with an informative look at how women experience the art world, from hiring and pay to mentorship and bias. Joining me to break it all down is our news editor, Margaret Carrigan, who has been leading on this project since last year. Margaret recently moderated a panel discussion on the topic in London with 3 industry powerhouses by her side: gallerist Sadie Coles, India Phillips from Bonham's Auction House, and Clary Wallace, the director of Turner Contemporary, which is a public institution. She's also the editor of a 4-part editorial series on the findings, which you can read now on Artnet News. Margaret, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I'm really excited to dive into this topic. Are you riding high off of the panel discussion earlier in the week?
Yeah, I have to say, we were expecting quite a few people, but the actual turnout floored me. And we had almost 400 people come. It was over and beyond what I thought we were going to have there. And it was so exciting to see so many people really, really wanting to get into this topic. Good vibes.
It really does show how interested people are to kind of unpack this data. So tell me about the genesis of the project, which is called Hardwiring Change for Women in the Arts Workforce. What prompted you to take it on?
So the Association for Women in the Arts, which is headquartered here in London, they approached us last year about this. And as a woman in the arts, I was like, well, this speaks to me. I find myself to be a bit of a millennial statistic. I'm one of those people that's had a lot of jobs in what is a relatively short career span so far. And a lot of that was also just because I've worked several jobs at a time. I think that's a very common experience when you're working in the arts, is that you're often trying to make ends meet via various things. When I first got out of college, I was working out as a bank teller, and then I'm working at a gallery on the weekends and evenings and things like that. So just the patchwork nature, I think a lot of the arts, I think is really key to that. And I just wanted to explore the kinds of barriers that women face when they are going through our industry.
Yeah, you actually worked outside of the art industry for a period of time as well, right?
I did. I had what I called my art world sabbatical for 3 years. Women that I've just spoken to anecdotally, but this also came out in some of the survey comments that we got back as well, is that you hit kind of your mid-career period and you're just really not sure how to move forward. There's multiple reasons for that, but I was one of those people that I was just I don't really see how to progress here. I'm really frustrated. I'm feeling like I can't really get what I need out of this career, so maybe I'll just go try something else. And it was really helpful, actually. I'm not saying it's the right path for everybody, but it is a path. It's an option available, and it was helpful to kind of see how another industry works and what's the same, what's different, and what we can kind of take from that in our own industry. And it ultimately did lead me back to working in the arts, obviously. I'm here. Mm-hmm. But it gave me a lot more clarity around what I want out of my career and maybe how to get that. So I think that that was also something that was of interest in terms of just kind of speaking to such a wide range of women with this survey, is really hearing back on other experiences like that or different, or doing a mind share of experience so that we could all collectively move forward a little bit easier.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and it's no secret that women make up a significant proportion of the arts workforce. Leadership, however, often is male-dominated. Can you tell us about our data set about this issue and what's driving the gap, and how can organizations help more women advance into senior positions?
So what's really interesting about this survey data that we got back is that nearly half of all respondents who reported working in micro businesses or businesses that are under 10 employees, and then another roughly third of respondents working in firms that were under 50 employees, said that women filled 76 to 100% of senior roles in their workplaces.
Wow.
And then that really started to taper off the larger the institutions or the firms got. So around 40% of respondents in businesses with fewer than 50 employees said there is at least gender parity, but that shrank to just 8.7% in organizations that had over 250. So it really showed that the larger the institution, the fewer women there were at the top, even as the overall proportion of women in those workforces increased with the organizational size.
What does this mean, really?
I think there's a lot of networked social issues around this, so that we can't point to one thing specifically necessarily, but it does suggest that there is a barrier to advancement for women, right? And I think what came through anecdotally in some of the comments in this survey was that there was a large sense that women were often passed over because of their gender. So that's not necessarily something inherent in the industry. That's a larger social factor. But then on top of that, there was issues around childcare was a big one that really came through. So a lot of women not being able to find roles within the industry that could accommodate the needs of flexible work so they could pick up kids from school, or just like meeting the salary net requirements to like pay for daycare and things like that. And I think those are like the industry specifics that really showed up in that data.
Yeah, I want to get to childcare more in depth in a minute. But let's just stick on this idea of the lack of representation of women in leadership. What were some of the solutions that came up, either through some of the comments in the survey or the panel discussion or our reporting that, can help elevate women?
One specific thing that really comes to mind that is in our feature story on this is that there are some galleries that are rethinking their organizational structure. And I think that this is something really interesting that other firms could potentially copy or look into themselves. It doesn't necessarily be this specific structure, but there's a specific gallery, Goodman Gallery, that has a couple locations, one here in London, one in Cape Town, one in New York. And they have what they call like a pod structure, which I think is really interesting. So basically, it's kind of like a mentorship program that's baked in to how they organize themselves internally. And it helps prepare entry-level and mid-career women for more leadership positions. So it's like an interdepartmental pod of people that manage and like take responsibility for things. I don't work there, so I can't speak to it specifically. But I think it's one of those things where it's like just kind of rethinking a hierarchical structure, like business structure, may prove really helpful in producing other avenues to advancement within our art firms. To that end, too, I think advocacy from senior leaders is really important. I think institutions really need to be conscious of actively sponsoring and promoting women internally. I do think that this advocacy question is rather interesting, that it dovetails with mentorship, but it isn't necessarily the same. It's really like simple things in a lot of ways, like shouting out someone for a job well done, whether that's in a meeting where their colleagues can see, or on Slack or in Teams or things like that, and making their work visible to people. And that's not something necessarily like that's just specific to women, but it is something that would greatly advantage women if they are having problems advancing in their careers.
Yeah, I think that that's a really interesting point. And I think that a lot of women don't focus on advocating for themselves either, and making the work that they do visible, because I think we're socialized sometimes to kind of expect a meritocracy or expect that good work will be recognized and rewarded, and actually not spending enough time making sure that the work that we do are visible. And I really think that having strong advocates within an organization to help make sure that that work is being made visible can really make a difference.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's those small tweaks too. And I think that's like a culture building moment, so if you are managing a team or run your own company or something, it's like a conscious choice you have to do. And I do think that the art world can be rather competitive, not always. There's a general sense, this was mentioned several times in comments on the survey, that there's a lot of competition in the field and it can be rather isolating in that way. So there's like just kind of breaking down those barriers a little bit internally and supporting people in your immediate network is really helpful.
One thing we haven't mentioned is just promoting women.
Yeah, promote women. Such a great way to get women into leadership positions, honestly. Um, and I think that this is happening more and more. There is, I would say, more just broad awareness around this socially already, but it still changes slow. And I think hiring a woman for a senior position is a great way just to make sure that other women also feel like they are able to advance in that firm. But I do think it can be a little bit of a double-edged sword. It's not something that really necessarily came out specifically in the data from our survey, but sometimes promoting from within also means that you don't necessarily get as big of a pay rise, rather if you are hired externally, which can be a barrier for women who are already saying they experience a inequity in pay. So I think that's something to be mindful of, is that if you're promoting a woman, make sure that you're offering her the right amount of money. I think that that's a tricky conversation.
Yeah, certainly. So if you're an institution, rather than looking externally whenever you're recruiting for these senior positions, look within your own stable. And there may be somebody who doesn't have the exact qualifications of that job because they've never held it before, but actually giving them that opportunity to grow into it could really benefit you. But yeah, don't be tempted to use that as an opportunity to also hire someone for much less than market value, market rate.
And on this topic too, I do think what is often undervalued when you promote internally, and I hope you don't mind if I use you as an example here, Naomi, but the wealth of information that hiring someone internally brings to that role. So you're a great example because you've been at Artnet for so long and you've worked so many different roles within the news side. So you know the ins and outs of this job like nobody's business. And so you have so much deep understanding of how our organization works, what can be done well, where we need to improve. And I think that kind of really valuable institutional knowledge isn't always recognized when you promote internally, but it's so, so valuable for a company. Having an external perspective is sometimes also really helpful, especially if there are inefficiencies in a workplace and you need to refine those and you need a fresh set of eyes on things. So I'm not saying that like internal hiring is always the right choice for every organization, but it certainly brings a whole host of benefits with it. And I think that that is often a way to really elevate your talent that you've been cultivating within an organization.
Yeah, absolutely. I think whenever you're recruiting into the company on the lower levels, like that's maybe where you should be looking externally to hire, but looking first internally, like, is there somebody here who is ready to take this change? We touched a little bit on salaries and pay there, and I think it's a good springboard to kind of talk about pay equity, which is a major concern kind of across industries. You worked with our colleague Sarah Cascone on an article that kind of delved into this among other issues and unpacked some of the known solutions to resolving pay inequity. Can you tell me a little bit about what the survey data told us about pay disparities in the arts and what solutions exist out there?
Sarah did a really great job of really going with, like, through the data with a fine-tooth comb on this point. And according to our respondents, over half of them believe they're paid less than men, which is pretty huge. And there's a noticeable gap in roles like curators and galleries and auction house specialists on that front. And then another 36% said that they think that they're paid somewhat lower, and then 18.4% said significantly lower. Just under 1% of respondents thought that they made more than a man, which I thought was really interesting. Around a quarter of them said that they thought they probably made about the same as their male peers. And I think that this is really variable too, based on what kind of role you're working in, especially in like high profile sales and commissions, like specialists at auction houses or really blue chip galleries. Those pay structures can be tied to bonuses that really widen that gender gap as well. Our report came out roughly around the same time as another report on salaries. So our survey didn't actually track discrete salary numbers, but another firm has been doing this since 2022. Sophie McPherson is also a recruitment firm specialized in the art world. And we have some figures that said that the median salary for a gallery manager in the UK is £40,000 or around $52,000, while for a gallery manager in the US, it's $70,000. And in the European Union, it's $49,000. So it also shows that there's lots of regional variance, and that can also really compound this kind of clarity around what you're worth in a role, like what to ask for. And I think having that transparency around salaries is really crucial for driving pay equity.
So let's talk about salary transparency. What is it and how do we get it?
It's one of the most actionable solutions. It's most what a lot of people in the survey said they wanted. It's publishing your salary. If you're posting a job, putting a salary band with that. It's doing internal reviews of salaries within the company. It's making sure that those are in alignment with a broader industry standard, and also making sure that they're actually fungible and that you're not quoting something that's like the salary range for that job is $50,000 to $300,000. That doesn't make any sense.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Salary banding was also something that came up in your panel discussion within organizations, which is whenever a company sort of defines salary levels for certain responsibilities. And that can also be a helpful tool in making sure that women are being paid fairly for the job description.
One thing that came through in some of the comments on the survey was that even when you have a salary band, that women often find that they get offered at the bottom of that rather than the top, and men are more consistently, whether by the fact that they're negotiating for themselves or they're just unconscious bias or conscious bias, they're getting offered at the top of that salary band. So I think that's where having, again, those fungible salary ranges that are important, so that it's not a gulf between the lower end and the top end.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. We also talked a little bit about negotiation and how can companies help women with that.
Again, this is one of those networked social issues where there's already been a lot of literature about how women maybe don't negotiate for themselves as much in the business space because they feel more insecure about it, or there's this perception that they need to be more amenable or malleable to whatever the business situation is, or more empathetic to the business's needs or something. So there's all sorts of complicating factors. And I don't want to make generalizations. And I think also too, some women will negotiate for themselves and it's perceived differently by other people. They react differently to a woman negotiating for themselves than they would a man. I personally experienced that in some of my own pay negotiations in different roles over the years. And I think that there's other ways you can negotiate. It's important to note that it's the company's responsibility to tell you that they can't give you more money. You shouldn't just assume they can't. But if they are upfront about that and they say this is really as high as we can go on the salary front, not being afraid to ask for other things that would make that job more valuable to you. So one person I know, when they said that they were maxed out on salary, she's like, okay, well, I would love more paid time off then. So she got an extra week of holiday as part of her contract with that firm. And that was really helpful to her because that just meant that she was able to take a little more time for herself while making the salary work as much as possible financially for her. And then there's other opportunities like negotiating for more flexible work hours if they're not able to offer more pay, or maybe a 4-day work week, things like that. Women shouldn't be afraid to ask for.
Yeah, mentorship, that's something that personally helped me on my journey as well, is being told how to negotiate basically by somebody who's done it before. And I think, one thing that I tend to remind people of whenever they are in a negotiation, that it is a negotiation and it is the job of the person who's on the other side of the table to you to tell you no, and to tell you that's impossible, to tell you that's a ridiculous number, and to make you feel small so that you accept their first offer. But it is always a negotiation. And I think remembering that first no is not accepted by everybody the first time. And generally, those people end up making that salary progression faster.
Mm-hmm.
So socioeconomic background is also something that came up a little bit within the survey, but mostly in the article that you worked on with writer Amy Dawson. She spoke to Meg Malloy, who is an advocate for working class people in the arts. So can you tell me a little bit about the barriers that specifically lower income workers are facing and how the industry can create more opportunities for them?
Yeah, this pay issue feeds into the barriers to entry or the barriers to diversity in the arts workplace, really specifically, because oftentimes gallery internships or curatorial assistant roles and museum fellowships, they're really low paid or in some cases not paid. And I think there's been a lot of noise around that over the last few years, and that has changed some policies. And I think we just need to keep making noise on that front. And obviously, so much of the art world is concentrated in really expensive cities like New York and London and Paris and things like that. And it's really difficult to find jobs that can support just a living wage in a city that has those kinds of demands on rent and just cost of living. So I think that those are like the really specific issues that come through when we're talking about pay and the barriers to entry in the art world specifically. And obviously, the subject of art is a specialized subject, and that's also not widely available in education systems. So the need to take on additional schooling or to go into a specialized program is a huge financial investment for people that don't have another way to, if they don't get a scholarship or if they don't have parents that can help them pay for that degree. And our survey did reveal that there's really not a strong correlation between getting an advanced degree and getting more pay. So even when you take on that responsibility of getting a degree to be in a specialized field, it's not compensated. A lot of people that don't come from a socioeconomic background that can support them through that, it pushes them out immediately or within the first few years because they just can't make ends meet. And I think that's one of the issues that we really need to continue delving in on and getting more data around.
Are there things that the industry can do now to kind of start to break these barriers down?
Again, going back to the transparency issue, I think that is like a monumental first step. The more regularly and consistently art firms can do that, the better for everybody. It just reduces the gatekeeping around it. It helps people, make an informed decision about whether that role is good for them and what they can feasibly make do with. And on top of that, it also raises awareness so that if there is a real lack or a systemic problem in the pay in these areas, we can advocate and push that forward on an industry level. We noted that some of these jobs are underpaid or not paid. Paying people would be a great first start for those jobs. Offering some sort of pay for an internship, I think, is absolutely crucial. And like I said, I do think that that's changing now, but there's still a lot of jobs out there that offer exposure and experience to the industry as compensation. And that does not allow you to pay your rent. And expanding hiring pipelines. Clary from Turner Contemporary mentioned this on our panel the other day about how they partner with universities and community colleges or other organizations to provide fellowships and inroads into positions within the organization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think establishing those pipelines is really important. Speaking from my experience as a hiring manager, I think often when you are in a position where you're hiring, you need to act quite quickly. And whenever you need to take a decision quickly, you are more tempted to go in the direction of a known entity, someone you've worked with before, they're plug and play, or somebody who's already in the industry. And so you're not actually taking that opportunity to bring in somebody from a different background. And I think whenever you have those pipelines in place already, you then have that to draw on whenever you need to take those urgent decisions. So that was really, really valuable insights from Clary there. Mm-hmm. I want to talk about workplace bias. So both explicit, I would hope that it's mostly coming up in the unconscious form. I wish people weren't overtly sexist, but I'm sure it does happen still within the industry. So I want to be careful about what I say there. But can we talk about bias? How does bias show up in the workplace, and what can institutions or galleries or auction houses do to counteract it?
Yeah, like you said, we hope it's unconscious, but there may be consciousness behind it. But the unconscious part is I think pushing women into more administrative roles or asking them to take on duties that are more administrative on top of their roles, that just kind of bogs them down from doing other work. And again, like pushing themselves forward in a more leadership capacity. I think there was a really, really great response to our survey from one survey taker. She said the biggest and loudest example of bias that she had seen in the industry was working in an auction house. This was several years ago now, where she just saw a lot of Ivy League educated, super qualified women. They were hired for assistant roles, whereas a lot of men were then hired for private sales roles immediately. And she kind of said that the men were getting put in the swimming pool to start with, and women had to find their way to that pool. And that's really great if you can find support or an advocate or a mentor that can help you get out of that lane that you're put in initially. But that's also a big if. Not everyone will find that. If you are in a management position within a company, like taking a look at where the most women are in your company and like reflecting on that and seeing if there's a way to bridge that gap, if there's reasons for that maybe are gender specific, breaking that down a little bit more. I do think that there's also a bit of a confidence gap among women. This is, again, goes back to the socialization of women that we talked about before, and not something necessarily super specific to the art world, but plays out in it. It's actually something that Meg Malloy, who we interviewed for the editorial series about her Working Arts Club organization that she founded, that this can be really acute among not only women, but just people from different socioeconomic backgrounds where maybe they feel like they don't have the same schooling background or they don't have the same networks as some of these other people. So they feel like they really can't push themselves forward in the same way. She said specifically, like there's this constant sense that you're just lucky to be there. So you might as well just like take it on the chin kind of thing. And I think that is really key in terms of talking about that more and normalizing it and realizing that lots of people are feeling that way and it doesn't necessarily need to hold you back. In terms of solutions, it's, again, simple things. It's writing job descriptions. Job descriptions are really informally put together. It's updating those job descriptions when that person is doing more. It's mapping out paths to progression within your organization. Like, what does it mean to be a director and what does it mean to be a senior director? And that should be consistent. What is the level up there? If someone's like, I want to move out of this director role and be a senior director, like, how do you coach them? How do you work with them? Be like, okay, that's great. Like, I would love to develop you in that role. And bias training exists. You can contract people to do that for you. I think that's incredibly helpful. I worked for an organization outside of the art world when I, again, took my art world sabbatical. And I thought what was really interesting is that company was very invested in that. And they did bias training for everyone. And also, if you were promoted into a management role, you are obligated to take a management course online. I think it was through Harvard, but don't quote me on that. It was just like an online course that the company would fund so that when you get into a senior role and you are managing other people, you have more tools at your disposal so that you can be a more equitable manager. And I was like, huge. That's incredible. And I wish more companies would think about that investment. Again, back to our earlier point about promote talent from within and why that's so valuable to a company, that like investing in that course, it's kind of a drop in the bucket monetarily. I know budgets are stretched and whatnot, but like it can pay off hugely in the long run.
Yeah. People can also just take those bias trainings seriously as well. I think people love to giggle about having to do sexual harassment training in the workplace and, oh, well, how ridiculous is this scenario that's very, very explicit. But I think in doing that, you push away the idea that actually you probably do have unconscious biases and they're unconscious and you might not realize it, but you are going to benefit from this. And maybe you're going to catch yourself whenever you're looking around the room in the meeting and assuming that the one woman in the room is going to be the one who's going to take the minutes, even though she's not a secretary.
Yeah. India of Bonham's Auction House said something really interesting about this on our panel. It's a small but concrete thing that everyone can immediately do, is that you don't need to make assumptions. You can just ask that woman what she wants out of her role, sort of thing. Like, does she want to be traveling more? Does she not want to be traveling more? Like, I think within the art world, the travel component and like the out of hours work, openings, exhibitions, like client relationships, things like that, it's very much what the art world is based on. People might make assumptions about a woman's availability or interest in doing those things based on, just how she maybe presents at work or if she has kids or things like that, but rather just like the bias part of it is just kind of like checking it in yourself. And it's like, oh, did she actually say that she didn't want to be at that dinner or on that trip? Or am I assuming that? So I'll just go check with her to see. And I think that can be really valuable. And just like that moment of taking a minute and asking a woman what she needs out of her role.
Work-life balance and caregiving responsibilities specifically is something that came up time and time again. In the panel, it was a recurring theme, and Katya Kazakina, our colleague, a senior reporter here at Artnet News, spoke to the gallerist Marian Bowski about her own experiences and the challenges of navigating motherhood within the industry. How does these issues of work-life balance and caregiving, how does it impact women's career progression, and what sort of policies can make a difference?
I can't underscore enough how big this was in our survey. It was huge. 93.4% of respondents said that childcare had impacted their careers in some way. And that also included around 5% of respondents who said that they had chosen not to have kids because they were more interested in focusing on their career. So I think that's really interesting. It's not just women with children that are reporting this. This issue of, again, like the unpredictable hours or the out of hours work demands in what is a very relationship and network driven industry, the exhibition openings, the events, traveling for art fairs, and all of this compounds, right? And it often makes it really difficult for women, especially who, as other studies have demonstrated how often women take on an inordinate amount of care and other domestic labor outside of their jobs. So I think what was kind of also interesting too is that in terms of like advancing women, a lot of being available for those kinds of events or those work trips or those things, that's often seen as one of the ways to advance within a role, like building those relationships, being visible in that way, pulling those like long hours to demonstrate the dedication to your artist or to your, whatever. It really impacts women from being able to then also participate in their home life. So when we talk about advancement, if the woman's trying to do all of that, then it's also taking away time from doing other things she needs to be doing at home. And that can negatively impact her. This goes back to bias. Like maybe you perceive her as not being interested in advancing because she's not able to go to all the openings, but she might be. So like, what is a workaround for that? In our survey too, around 1% had said that they actually declined promotions because they couldn't handle the additional workload on top of everything else they were doing at that moment in their life, which I think is rather interesting. In terms of solutions, I think this is like something that's really on everybody's mind post-pandemic, but like more flexible scheduling and remote work opportunities, I think can be really freeing for women. A moment in the panel discussion, an audience member, part of one of their questions, she noted that in the pandemic, she thrived because she was able to work remotely and how important that was for her in her career. Sadie Coles did note that not every role can be remote. Like if you are in a client-facing role or if you are, front of house at a gallery, like you can't necessarily work from home. You can't make a broad generalization about remote work for every single position. But if there are ways for a company to allow that, especially if you're in an administrative or a research role or something like that, that could be a hybrid or remote role, and that could help you retain talent and advance that woman working in that role while also increasing her work-life balance overall. And just having a little more attention to that, or just being more thoughtful about how to structure that in an arts workplace, could be really valuable. Paid family leave policies, making sure that that's documented. And there's, I think, kind of a lack of formal parental leave policies, and especially smaller arts organizations. That is something that came up, within the comments back on the survey. And I think one thing I really appreciated in the panel discussion is that Sadie said, invest in HR. Even if you're a small business, have an HR person, because it makes it so much easier to manage those things. And that not only should individuals working at that establishment know their rights, they should also know what they can ask of their boss, right? And the HR person helps field that. And she's like, yeah, it's an added expense, but it's something that you don't have to, as a business owner, individually have to field each time. You have an authority on it and someone that can help you and help them. And it just streamlines the whole thing and how valuable that can be for a business. So yeah, HR sounds great. I've worked in so many arts organizations where that really wasn't a priority. And it's always kind of flummoxed me. And it's created unnecessary issues.
Yeah, and Sadie also pointed out that even if you don't have the budget for this role in-house, there are external consultancies that do provide HR support. So that's a lower cost solution for some businesses. I think it's interesting as well, just the point that you were making about flexible work and remote options. I was chatting with one woman just after the discussion, and she mentioned that some institutions or some companies are using the idea of, oh, well, people were less productive actually at home during the pandemic, so we can't give you this option now. But they kind of neglected to recognize the fact that actually during the pandemic and during lockdown, a lot of women were actually at home and their kids were at home and they had to be doing homeschool at the same time as doing their jobs. So it's not a fair kind of comparison to how people could actually work within those structures. So I just thought that was an interesting observation.
Very interesting.
I want to talk about mentorship because we asked about the barriers to equity and solutions that could help, and mentorship came up as one thing. And we also got some data on what areas of mentorship people are interested in. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah. So around 37.5% of the survey respondents said that mentorship programs were like the most effective way to improve access for women entering the art field. And another 31% highlighted increased networking opportunities as another way to like enhance access. So like those overlap a bit, but also could be distinct as well. And what I thought was the most interesting out of our survey, though, is that it wasn't just limited to entry-level, early career women. 79% of mid-career and senior professionals expressed an interest in receiving mentorship. And I think that's like so telling. This is really across the board. It's not just about getting into the industry. It's about staying in the industry and like changing things continually. I think women are so interested in this right now. And the mentorship question, too, will be really key to building more intersectional diversity among women in the field as well. That came through very strongly in the comments from survey respondents. And that's at the heart of why Meg Malloy started her own networking. She works at a gallery full-time. That's why she started working arts clubs, so that there was more of a platform for anyone from a different socioeconomic background to help each other navigate this. And there's been a lot of organizations over the last couple of years that have cropped up elsewhere that are also focusing on that. There's Women of Color in the Arts and Black Girls in Art Spaces. They're both based in the US. There's another mentoring organization, Art Table, that has launched like a diversity-based fellowship. AWITA has a program that they've launched that's open to all genders for professionals in the first 5 years of their career. So I do think that this is happening, but the more that we can do to support that, the long-term gains will be substantial.
Art Market Mentors is another formalized mentorship program for the commercial art world as well.
In our feature story, too, there was a great quote from a woman who also runs her own mentoring organization. And like she kind of said that when she started, she had like handwritten notes to some women to be like, hey, can you help me? And she said she only ever got one response back, but that one response was enough to like really help shape her career. So I think like knowing that these more formal opportunities for networking and mentorship are available now, take advantage of that and get involved with them. See how you can mentor mid-career and senior women looking for mentorship. I think that can also take many different forms. It doesn't necessarily mean also doing peer mentoring with other mid-career and senior women. Clary from Turner Contemporary noted in the panel the value of reverse mentorship. So speaking with younger people coming into the field, hearing what their needs are, acknowledging your position in a senior role and how you can help them, but also they can teach you about blind spots you might have or ways that you could improve, or like the way other things are developing and how things are shifting in the business landscape for younger people makes you a better manager and a better business owner and a better director if you're actually like hearing and understanding what's happening for other younger people.
One thing I know you wanted to talk about is that not all mentors have to be women.
Huge. Yes, men can mentor too. There's this women helping women, and we love that. But also, I think men need to be actively participating in this conversation and sharing their time and professional experience. If you work with a woman, if you're managed by a woman, if you manage a woman yourself, it affects everybody. Men can be also actively doing and aware of and offering their time for. So even if it says that this is an organization for mentoring women, like you could still get involved. You could still be a mentor.
Yeah. Just thinking about our listeners, this conversation about gender equity is a huge one. It involves many networked issues and it can feel quite overwhelming. So what is one impactful change that either an individual or somebody who is in a decision-making position at an institution in the arts can make?
Start simple. That's what I keep coming back to. Really small changes you can make that make a big difference. So individuals, I think, can advocate for salary transparency in their workplace. I think that that's a huge thing. It's just bring this up often and consistently with leadership. Make it a priority within the company. Also, again, be a mentor. There's a little bit of like imposter syndrome around that. It's like, oh, what would I have to say? If you've worked a couple of roles, if you've been in the job, you have something to offer. You have something to say. So like either get involved with a program with it or just find someone that you work with and offer your time, meet them for coffee or set up weekly one-to-ones with them, even if they're not someone you're directly managing. It's just someone that you have skills that you can share with them and enrich their own professional journey. Like that's huge. Back to India's point, like just calling out bias in hiring and promotion and just everyday general conversations. If you see something, say something. And that doesn't need to be like super aggressive or like punitive or anything like that. You can just pull someone aside and be like, hey, I heard you say this. And I just wanted to say like, did you check with her about that? Or I just wonder if maybe we should go back to her directly and ask about that rather than saying that, or what you said made me feel uncomfortable even. It doesn't need to be a super incendiary conversation. It can be really straightforward and just the facts. In terms of organizations, back to the pay audits and salary banding, if your employees are asking for that, do it. It's a simple first step. A lot of organizations that we spoke to within the course of the survey said that they had undertaken that. And that, like, honestly, there were tweaks to make within those salary bands, and it took a little bit of time. There's consultants that can help with that, but that overall, it was not as painful as they necessarily expected it to be. And then, again, creating leadership pipelines for women in any sort of roles and be really clear about what that looks like. And top of mind was the flexible work priorities. So that seems to be a really easy way that organizations can offer a lot more support for women and just help them navigate their lives and support them through what they're doing and make them better workers off the back of it.
That's great. So we've covered a lot today. One thing is really clear, that while there still are barriers to equity, there also are real solutions. And it's through research and reporting and open dialogues like this one that we can begin to break them down. So thank you so much, Margaret, for sharing your insights today. It's been really inspiring.
Thank you. This has been great.
That's it for this week's episode. If you like what you heard, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Also, take a moment to rate and review us. It will help other listeners discover what we're doing. The Art Angle is produced by Sonia Manalili, with contributions from Kate Brown, Ben Davis, Caroline Goldstein, and Naomi Ray. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.